Every expedition that went to Antarctica before 1960 came back with something they were not allowed to talk about. Not one, not two, every single one of them. And the cargo was never just ice samples. Let's start at the very beginning, because the beginning is already strange. In 1772, British naval officer James Cook crossed the Antarctic Circle for the first time in recorded history. 2 ships, brutal cold. He never saw land, but he got close enough, about 240 kilometers from the continental shore, and what he wrote in his log was oddly careful. He described vast walls of ice extending in every direction, and then he said the land beyond them, if it existed, was not worth finding. He had every reason to keep going. He turned back instead. His published account mentioned abundant seals and whales in the Southern Ocean. That part got out. The rest of Cook's observations from those latitudes were buried inside naval records for decades. The sealers who followed him understood the assignment. Between the 1780s and 1839, approximately 1,175 sealing voyages reached Antarctic and subantarctic waters. 25 scientific expeditions were recorded in the same period, 1,175 commercial trips, 25 scientific ones. And here is what the Encyclopedia Britannica, in its historical overview of Antarctic exploration published in the October 2023 update, says about those commercial voyages. The sealers charted island and sea routes, then kept this information secret so as not to reveal their hunting locations. Secret charts, secret routes. They knew where they were going, and they did not want anyone else to know. If you value documented exploration history and suppressed geographical records like this, subscribe. It is the best way to support our work. Also, comment from which city you are hearing this. This script is researched and factual, drawing on sources including the Britannica Historical Archive of Antarctic Exploration, last updated in March 2026, and the Australian Antarctic Program's official prehistory repository at antarctica.gov.au, which documents fossil records and classified geological firsts, going back to the earliest landings. These are not conspiracy blogs. These are government scientific agencies and encyclopedias. Now back to the story. The first confirmed sighting of the continent itself happened on January 27, 1820, when Russian Admiral Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, aboard the Vostok, reported a mass of ice at 69 degrees south latitude, near what is now the Fimbul ice shelf. 3 days later, British Royal Navy officer Edward Bransfield caught sight of the Antarctic Peninsula's mountains. Within the same week, American sealing captain Nathaniel Palmer spotted the coast from his ship, the Hero. 3 different nations, 3 different sightings, all within 8 days of each other in January of 1820. That is not coincidence. That is a race. And none of them told the whole truth about what they found when they got closer. Here is what the continent was hiding from the very first landing. On February 7th, 1821, American sealer John Davis and his crew aboard the Cecilia may have set foot on Antarctic soil near Hughes Bay on the Antarctic Peninsula. That landing is still marked as disputed in the official record. Disputed. A man steps onto a continent and it gets marked uncertain. What is not disputed is what Carl Anton Larsen found when he led Norwegian expeditions in the 1890s. On Seymour Island, just off the northern tip of the Antarctic Peninsula, Larsen found fossils. Ancient fossils. And petrified wood in Antarctica. In the most frozen place on Earth, there was petrified wood. That detail made it into a footnote in expedition reports. It did not make headlines. What did make headlines, briefly before the press was quieted, were the things Scotsmen dragged back to their tent in February of 1912. Robert Falcon Scott and his 4 companions reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, only to discover Norwegian explorer Roald Amundsen had beaten them there by 33 days. Beaten, exhausted, and dying, they began the return journey. On February 8th, Scott directed his party toward the rock moraine below Mount Buckley on the Beardmore Glacier. He wrote in his diary that it was like going ashore after a sea voyage, the delight of setting foot on rock after 14 weeks of snow and ice. What they found in those rocks stopped them cold in a different way. Fossilized leaves, pressed into stone at 82 degrees south latitude. The fossil-bearing rocks of the Permian period, 280 to 300 million years old, carrying the unmistakable imprint of Glossopteris, a fern-like tree that had once grown in warm, temperate forests across an ancient supercontinent called Gondwana. The same plant fossils had been found in Africa, India, South America, and Australia. Now here they were in the frozen heart of Antarctica. Scott's men were starving, frostbitten, barely able to haul their sledges. They threw everything else overboard to survive. They kept the rocks. 16 kilograms of fossil-bearing stone dragged hundreds of kilometers across the Ross ice shelf by men on the edge of death. They knew what they had. They could not leave it behind. When the search party found Scott's tent on November 12, 1912, all 5 men were dead. Scott had died around March 29th. The tent was buried in snow. Next to the frozen bodies were the rocks, 35 pounds of Glossopteris fossils, still strapped to the sledge. 2 years later, botanist Albert Seward at Cambridge University identified the specimens. The scientific establishment quietly acknowledged that Antarctica had once been a warm, forested continent. The continental drift theory, still widely ridiculed at the time, got a critical piece of its evidence. That was in 1914. The proof that Antarctica was once covered in ancient forests, connected to the other southern continents, carrying trees and warmth and life. That evidence had been sitting in those rocks for 280 million years, and it took a group of dying men dragging a sledge across an ice shelf to bring it out. Antarctica was not always dead, not even close. The coal deposits in the Transantarctic Mountains, which stretch 3,500 kilometers across the continent, are a direct record of that fact. Coal is compressed plant material. It forms in warm swamps. The British Antarctic Survey has confirmed extensive coal seams across the Transantarctic Mountains, and the first official record of coal in Antarctica was made by Frank Wild during Ernest Shackleton's Nimrod expedition in 1908 near the Beardmore Glacier. Shackleton himself, during that same expedition, found impressions of leaves in sandstone boulders while making the first descent of the Beardmore Glacier. Leaf impressions in Antarctica in 1908. He noted it and moved on. The world did not pay much attention, and then the governments started arriving. Not sealers, not scientists. Governments. With ships, with soldiers, with cameras bolted to aircraft. The year is 1946. World War II has been over for 14 months. The Soviet Union and the United States are already positioning for the Cold War. On August 26, 1946, Admiral Chester Nimitz announces Operation Highjump, officially titled the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program. On paper, it is a training exercise, a way to test ships and helicopters in polar conditions. In practice, it is the largest expedition ever mounted to any continent anywhere, at any point in human history. Task Force 68, 4,700 men, 13 ships, including an aircraft carrier, 33 aircraft. They depart from Norfolk, Virginia, on December 2nd, 1946. They reach the Bay of Whales on January 15th, 1947. The mission lasts 3 months. It is planned for 6. The Navy gives no official reason for the early withdrawal. Some participants later say the ice was unusually heavy. Norwegian trawlers in the area confirmed the pack ice was the thickest seen in more than 40 years. 3 men die. 2 helicopters are lost. One plane, the Martin PBM-5 George 1, crashes on Thurston Island on December 30th, 1946, killing 3 crew members, Ensign Maxwell Lopez, and petty officers Wendell Henderson and Frederick Williams. 6 survivors are stranded for 13 days before rescue. The operation produces 49,000 aerial photographs and maps 1.5 million square miles of the continent. And then, aboard the command ship USS Mount Olympus, Rear Admiral Richard Byrd gives an interview to Lee Van Ada of the International News Service. The interview runs in the Chilean newspaper El Mercurio on March 5th, 1947. Byrd does not talk about training exercises or aerial photography. He says the United States must adopt immediate defensive measures against the possibility of invasion by hostile planes coming from the polar regions. He says that in the event of a new war, the continental United States could be attacked by flying objects capable of moving from pole to pole at incredible speeds. He calls it a bitter reality. The word he uses is bitter. He is not a man who uses dramatic language lightly. He had already flown over the North Pole in 1926 and the South Pole in 1929. He had been to Antarctica 3 times before this mission. He knows what he saw, and he calls it a bitter reality. Historian D.N. Olson Belanger, writing in Smithsonian Magazine in 2007, confirmed that the U.S. Navy had classified orders during Operation Highjump to establish territorial claims in Antarctica, orders that were not made public at the time of the operation. The official mission statement was equipment testing. The classified orders were about sovereignty, about claiming territory on a continent that had never been claimed by any nation, and about doing it before someone else did. That someone else was the Soviet Union. In 1950, when the United States tried to negotiate some form of international arrangement over Antarctica, the Soviets informed the claimant states plainly that they would not accept any agreement in which they were not represented. The fear, documented in U.S. State Department records, was that the Soviet Union would make a territorial claim and bring the Cold War physically to the ice. What those records do not fully explain is why. What was there that 2 superpowers at the height of nuclear tension were willing to send fleets and armies to control? Part of the answer is coal. The Transantarctic Mountains hold some of the largest coal deposits on Earth. The Ross Sea oil and gas fields, confirmed in 1973, are offshore but accessible. The Prince Charles Mountains contain significant iron ore deposits. The continent is a geological vault, but by the 1950s, the strategic value was not just minerals. The geology of the continent had started producing findings that made governments very uncomfortable. Beneath the ice of Antarctica, radar and seismic surveys were beginning to reveal something that should not be there: a mountain range the size of the Alps, completely buried under 1.8 kilometers of ice. The Gumburtsev Mountains. They stretched 1,200 kilometers beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, peaks reaching 2,700 meters. Origins still not fully explained by plate tectonics. They are too tall, too preserved, too isolated from any known geological event that would have created them. Their discovery, confirmed through airborne radar surveys conducted in the 1950s and 60s, was treated as a curiosity and filed away. Today, the National Academies of Sciences publication from 2007 on subglacial Antarctic aquatic environments notes plainly that the Gumburtsev Mountains have anomalously high relief for a cratonic region, and that their origins remain one of Antarctica's major unresolved geological questions. And beneath that same ice sheet, more than 400 subglacial lakes, water that has been sealed from the surface for millions of years, kept liquid by geothermal heat and pressure. Lake Vostok, the largest, covers an area similar to Lake Ontario. It lies beneath 4 kilometers of ice. In the 1990s, when Russian scientists finally drilled into the lake's accreted ice near the Russian Vostok station, DNA sequencing revealed 3,500 microbial genes. 94% of them were species unknown to science. Unknown. In a lake that had been sealed for an estimated 15 million years, life that evolved in complete darkness, at sub-zero temperatures, under pressure, without sunlight, without contact with the surface biosphere. Life that was doing just fine down there, alone, for 15 million years, while humans evolved from tree-dwelling primates into something that eventually showed up with a drill. The ice cores themselves hold the older record. Pollen and spores preserved in Antarctic ice cores indicate that nothofagus beech forests existed here 32 million years ago, when temperatures were approximately 17 degrees Celsius warmer, and sea levels were up to 60 meters higher. The continent was alive. It was green. It was warm. And in the transantarctic mountains, southern beech fossils, Nothofagus beardmorensis, found only 400 kilometers from the South Pole, have been dated to 2 to 3 million years old. Not 300 million, 2 to 3 million. Within the lifespan of our genus. When our direct ancestors were walking upright in East Africa, Antarctica still had trees near the pole. On December 1st, 1959, 12 nations signed the Antarctic Treaty in Washington. Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the United Kingdom, the United States, and the Soviet Union. The treaty banned military activity, prohibited nuclear testing, froze all territorial claims, and required that scientific findings be freely shared. It was, as the U.S. State Department records note, the first arms control agreement of the Cold War. It came into force on June 23, 1961. From that date, the rules of engagement changed. Before 1960, every major power sent military forces. After 1960, they sent scientists, and the findings those scientists carried back were subject to international disclosure protocols that had not existed before. What that means for everything before 1960 is this: there was no requirement to share, no obligation to disclose, no international body with the right to inspect what you brought back or what you found. The sealers kept secret charts. The naval expeditions had classified orders. Operation Highjump produced 49,000 photographs, and the full analytical results were never released to the public. The British polar explorer Frank Wild noted coal seams in 1908 and kept his expedition notes in Admiralty files. Shackleton found leaf impressions in rock, and they did not make the front pages of any newspaper. Scotsmen died for their fossils, and the world spent more time mourning the men than studying what they carried. Every expedition returned with sealed cargo. Some of it was mineral, some of it was geological, some of it was photographic. And some of it was in the heads of men like Byrd, who used words like bitter reality and then went quiet. 45,000 meteorites have been recovered from Antarctica since systematic collection began, more than from any other location on Earth. Among them, fragments from Mars and from the Moon, in a cold, dry environment that preserves objects with extraordinary fidelity. The continent has been collecting samples from the solar system for millions of years, undisturbed, waiting. A 300-mile-wide impact crater, possibly dating back 250 million years to the Permian-Triassic extinction, the largest mass extinction in Earth's history, lies buried more than a mile beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet in the Wilkes Land region. The crater is confirmed by gravity measurements. The event it records may have initiated the breakup of Gondwana itself, cracking the supercontinent that once included Antarctica, South America, Africa, India, and Australia into the separate land masses we recognize today. In 1955, Byrd returned to Antarctica one final time as part of Operation Deep Freeze, a mission organized by a Joint Chiefs Committee and officially authorized by President Eisenhower. Byrd died on March 11, 1957, 2 years before the Antarctic Treaty was signed, 4 years before it came into force. He never gave another interview like the one in El Mercurio. He never used those words again in public, but the words are still there in the Chilean newspaper archives, dated March 5th, 1947. Flying objects, pole to pole, bitter reality. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 locked the continent down under international law, just as the radar and seismic surveys were beginning to map what was actually under the ice. The Gomburtsev Mountains were surveyed in that same window. The subglacial lakes were being detected. The coal seams, the fossil forests, the meteoric record, the potential mineral fields in the Ross Sea, all of it was coming into focus at the exact moment the treaty made the whole continent off limits for exploitation and required transparency in findings. That timing is not an accident. 12 nations with competing territorial claims, nuclear ambitions, and Cold War paranoia sat down in Washington in 1959 and agreed in 60 negotiating sessions between June 1958 and October 1959 on rules that none of them wanted to follow alone. They made the agreement because the alternative, open competition over what they had already found down there, was worse than the treaty. In 1912, Robert Falcon Scott was found dead 11 miles from his supply depot with 35 pounds of ancient forest fossils still strapped to his sledge. He threw away food, he threw away fuel, he kept the rocks. The men who found his body that November retrieved the journals and the fossils, and left the tent as his tomb. When they returned to Britain, Cambridge botanist Albert Seward studied those Glossopteris specimens and published his findings in 1914. The paper confirmed Antarctica was once forested and connected. The world read it and moved on. But the governments did not move on. They kept sending ships. They kept bringing things back. They signed a treaty in 1959 to make it all official and peaceful and transparent. And the sealed cargo from before that date stays sealed. The ice holds memory the way nothing else on Earth does. Somewhere under 4 kilometers of Antarctic ice, Lake Vostok contains water that has not touched the surface in 15 million years. The microbes in that water are 94% unknown to science. The mountains above that lake have no geological explanation that fully satisfies the data. And somewhere in the Wilkes Land Basin, under a mile of ice, is a crater from the impact that ended the Permian world 250 million years ago, the event that killed 96% of all species on Earth. It is still there. It has been there the whole time, waiting the way the continent always waits, cold, patient, sealed.